Hello, everyone. This is the 162nd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English author Mr. Gavin Buckland discussing his book, The End. From glory to a whole new ballgame, Everton from 1985 to 1994. Mr. Buckland is also the author of many Everton related books, such as Boys from the Blue Stuff, Everton's Rise to 1980s Glory, Money Can't Buy Us Love, Everton the 1960s, Everton Strange But Blue, Moments That Shocked and Surprised the Fans, and many others. Welcome back, Evan.
Hi, Sean. Welcome, everybody. Great to be asked to go on your excellent podcast after a
Thank,
while.
thank you. Appreciate it. Your book is a massive account of Everton history from the very top in 1984 to the Great Escape in 1994. When did you decide to write about this era of the club history?
I think you just explained it partially, mentioned a couple of the books. This is the third and last of a trilogy of a history of Everton from when John Moores, who was the owner of the massive Littlewoods organisation in England, which was a pools company, and then went into retail. They became associated with Everton through his chairmanship in 1960, and he ploughed money into the club. And so the first book you mentioned, I think you mentioned it then, Money Can't Buy Us Love, which obviously a play on the Beatles song, was about Everton in the 60s, as I say, when they were known as the Mersey Millionaires because of they had access to the Littlewoods funding. And so that finished in 73, that book. The natural progression was to do the next one, which was from 73, when Harry Catterick had just been sacked, who'd managed Everton during the Moyes era, from 73 up until 1985, when Everton were crowned league champions for the first time in 15 years. And that was a natural cut-off point for that book. And that this is the third of the trilogy because Moore sadly died in during the 1993-94 season. He was 97, and he was still the Littlewoods company still effectively were the major shareholders of Everton. The third book, which is The End, it's a homage to a fanzine that was around in Liverpool in the 80s. That's where I get the title. But it was The End on so many different respects. Because obviously John Moore's association with the club ended. And it was almost the end for Everton, and nearly got relegated at the end of that season. And I think also as well, it's a natural. I know you speak about the Premier League, on the podcast and stuff. I think it was though the Premier League started in 1992. I still think the first 2 years of the Premier League were really. It was very much like the feel of the old football league. I think the Premier League only really kicked off as a standalone competition in 94-95 when you had that terrific battle between Manchester United and Blackburn. So it was the end on many different levels, and 94 seemed a good way of finishing off the Moores era of Everton.
This book covers such a long era in detail. I mean, this could have easily been 2 or 3 books. What was the research process like, and how many people did you manage to interview for this massive book?
I've never, yeah, it's 160,000 words. I think the other two are 160,000 words as well, all hardbacks. I made it a rule when I did the first one, which I wrote in the 2010s, not to interview anybody for a number of reasons, just the practicality of it, though I've got access to players. I find that, and this is all just my own personal opinion, I find that when you're seeing interviews with old players, though not all the time, a lot of the stories they say, well, you've heard them all before, and you can twist facts and stuff, and you find sometimes the facts don't turn out when you check them, they're true. And also as well, I always think if you're writing a book, if you interview somebody, I find it really difficult to then criticise them on the very next page. So all the quotes I use in the book are contemporary quotes, which I think are far better. It's far better to hear what people thought at the time and what they do 20, 30 years later. And, I use a lot of newspaper quotes as well. And The research is, anybody will tell you the book, Sean, is the most onerous side of it, right? The book is easy in comparison. The number of newspaper files and, library visits and, you can get a lot of archive stuff on newspapers via the internet now, thankfully. It saves a lot of library trips to London and stuff. And it's just building it all together from that. I've never really just wanted to say, like, this is the history. That's it. I always like to give my own analysis of it and my own views on it, really, rather than just being a straight history, a linear history from A to B. I like to try and explain things, and also in the context of why the changes within the game. And certainly for the first two books, why the changes in society at the time, because the 60s and 70s and the 80s was paid a great change. And so I think not so much this book for a number of reasons, but certainly the first two, which is placing Everton within football and then placing football within wider society and its links to the wider economy and cultural changes within England specifically.
Your book starts in the aftermath of the 1985 league title, Everton at their zenith under the guidance of the rising manager Howard Kendall. They were seemingly headed for greatness in Europe. This bright future and reign is instantaneously derailed by the aftermath of the Heysel tragedy, which led to a European ban. Everton are at this point part of the Big Five, which is a running narrative in your book. Is this event the reference point of the gradual decline into 1994?
It's a question that's been much debated over the years, I think, by Everton supporters, not so much at the time, but certainly the fact that actually Everton have not been successful now for 30 years. It's a very interesting question that's probably worthy of a book in itself. I say in the book that I don't think that's the case. I think people say, the team broke up as a result of Heysel. For those listening who don't know aware of it, there was a ban on English clubs following the tragic events of Heysel in the 1985 European Cup final. And that ban lasted 5 years. And Everton won the title twice in that period and would have been in the European Cup twice. But people blame that for the breakup of the team, but the team didn't break up at all. Most of the team were there for 3 or 4 years after 85. And I think, Everton won a title 2 years after Heysel. So I don't think that affected us from a playing perspective, certainly initially. I mean, Howard Kendall went abroad in 1987, and you supplied me, so about research, you supplied me with some great stuff, didn't you, from yours archives about obscure interviews with Howard Kendall. And I think in that he said that he went to manage in Spain. And I think not having European football was a contributing factor, but he went to Bilbao, and Bilbao weren't even in Europe, So I think Howard had his other reasons to go. I think the financial package was very beneficial to him. So I don't think it did. And if it did, it wasn't to the extent that people believe was the case. I think maybe a few players went stale a little bit because if you weren't winning, one of the attractions of being in European football is if you're not winning the title, you can qualify for Europe, can't you, in the UEFA Cup? And when that's taken away from you, I think sometimes things drifted. So there was that aspect to it, was true. But I certainly think the whole ISIL thing has been overplayed, though I should say it is a reference point for the book. But it's always been too convenient to blame Heysel, and more specifically Liverpool, on that, when I think Everton's decline was far more closer to home, really.
And the immediate aftermath, the team was still competitive. In the 85-86 season, you have the arrival of Gary Lineker, and it could have been a double winning season, but in the end, it was the other team in Merseyside that won the double. In those years, it seems like each team were really pushing each other to greatness, and that was beneficial to the city and English football as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. John Moores, who took over the chairmanship of Everton in 1960 through the Litwoods organisation, was also very closely associated in Liverpool Football Club because he was a shareholder there. And there was a big Litwoods presence across both clubs. So I think that wouldn't be allowed now. And he used to say that it was very beneficial for the city to have two clubs competing. And that was, in the mid-80s, the Liverpool-Everton rivalry was probably the most dominant rivalry seen in English football up until that point. In the mid-80s, the first time two clubs had finished in the top 2 and 3 successive seasons. They played in 3 cup finals in that time, 2 FA Cup finals, 1 League Cup final. So they were the two dominant teams by a significant distance from about 1984 through to when Arsenal started to emerge under George Graham at the end of the decade. And that you are right. In the same way, I think that Manchester United and Manchester City probably drove each other out on at the end of the 2000s in England. It was noticeable that I think when I was there at the time, the interest in the city and football increased. I mean, when Everton in 84, 85, when Everton successful and Liverpool weren't, Liverpool attendances at Anfield went up by 3,000 again compared to the previous season when they'd won the league title, European Cup and League Cup, because people were talking about football again in the city and as equals. And so I think it was socially, it was also beneficial for the city, which was going through a very bad economic patch at the time. But oh yeah, almost certainly they drove each other on. But at a time when most players were British as well, so and I mean a lot of them knew each other off the pitch as well, socialised together. So yeah, absolutely, you're spot on there. It was something that I think happened to the benefit of both clubs really, and I'd say you saw it again. I think with the Manchester clubs 25 years later.
The 1986-87 season saw Everton regain the league title, the last to date, in a season riddled with many injuries. It fell below the swashbuckling style of 1985. What were the many narratives for this title win that has been somewhat forgotten over the years?
I think you started off there by saying injuries. I think that was the narrative. Everton used 23 players. If you have a look at teams that win titles, they don't use 23 players, and a lot of them players played game time. A lot of them qualified by playing 10 games. So it wasn't as if you had a load of players just making one or two games at the end of the season. So that was the first thing. I think that the second narrative was Everton, obviously the season before, which you alluded to, have lost out to Liverpool both in the league and the FA Cup. I mean, they were 8 points ahead of Liverpool in the February, and Liverpool caught them up. Then got beat by Liverpool in the FA Cup final. So you had that sort of horrific end to the season, which psychologically could have damaged a lot of clubs and management. So you had that aspect to it. I think also as well, I think it was all 87 was the time we won the title, but I think both teams were going into decline. I think Liverpool as a club were going into decline, I think, and Everton. So it wasn't the same as what it had been, say, 2 or 3 years before. If you have a look at the two teams who were playing at the end of that season, I don't think they were anywhere near as what they could have been they'd been 2 or 3 years before. And that was reflected in what happened in the years that followed. Liverpool had to go out and buy 3 or 4 players that summer. I think it was also a narrative. I think Arsenal started to come in that season. I think they'd had a really good season. Ferguson had taken over at Manchester United. Crowds went up that campaign after years and years and years of crowds going down. Attendances went back up in England. So it was part of, I think, of an upward curve in the game after the dark days of the mid-80s. I think the 86-87 season was the wider footballing sense had started. The worst was over, I think. I know obviously you had Hillsborough, but in terms of hooliganism and sort of football being a bit of a prize sport, I think 86-87 it started the revival that carried on through Italia 90 and beyond from the formation of the Premier League.
Unfortunately, the continuing Heysel ban forced the departure of Howard Kendall, as you mentioned earlier, to Spanish club Athletic Bilbao. So for the 1987-88 season, Colin Harvey was appointed, who in a way inherited a poison chalice. Was it inevitable that he could never match his predecessor?
I don't think Howard went exclusively abroad because of the European ban. I think it was a contributing factor, but I don't think it was the major contributing factor. I think the money was certainly an attraction because in Spain you only pay 20% tax. You pay 6% tax in England. I think Howard wanted to be a trainer as well. He wanted to get his coaching badges, and I think coaching stuff back on. And I think also as well, I think he just wanted a little bit out. There's a lot of pressure at Everton. And I think also the team needed rebuilding. I think he thought, I've done a lot of good work over the last 6 years. I could do that good work in 2 years if I get a rebuilding process wrong. So I think there was lots of reasons. I think the ban was one of them, but I don't think it was exclusively that, like many supporters will tell you. If it was inevitable about Colin Harvey not being successful, I don't think supporters felt like that at the time. The wisdom was that Colin had come to the club, well, I'd be promoted within the club to coach in 1983, and then all of a sudden the fortunes on the pitch changed completely. And I think there was a feeling of supporters that actually Colin was the power base, in the management, because of that. And therefore, if Howard went, Colin would just step seamlessly into his shoes. So at the time, it didn't seem like that, but looking back now, it was inevitable. A, because the team needed rebuilding. B, Colin had only very limited experience as a coach, 3 or 4 years at the first team. And as you well know, the hardest thing in football is to step up from being a coach to a manager. And Colin was a long list of people, great coaches who couldn't manage. In that respect, it was inevitable. And Howard was such a hard act to follow. And the team needed rebuilding. And then what you get is that friction, don't you? That I think happens at successful clubs when you bring new players in who maybe not as good. You get a bit of a split in the dressing room, which I'm sure has happened, say, in Man United, say when David Moyes came in the years after that. It happened at one or two other clubs. It didn't seem like it was inevitable he'd fail at the time, but I think it didn't take long, a couple of months, to realise actually it wasn't the same as under Howard. I think the board had been seduced by the fact that Liverpool had had that continuity over several years where he changed the manager and still being successful. But I think different to Liverpool was Liverpool had 7 or 8 backroom staff. So if one went, became manager, they still had that core there. Everton didn't have that. So yeah, it was inevitable, but not inevitable at the time.
With Colin Harvey, Everton slips down the table in the standings. In the 1988-89 season, you have the expensive acquisition of Tony Cuddy that didn't really work out in the end. And Everton managed to reach the FA Cup final, but lost to Liverpool in the final. From afar, it seemed like Everton were slowly slipping into mid-table mediocrity under Harvey. And the following season, 1989-90, is also similar. And in fact, in your book, you really point this season as the reference point where it's visible that the rot
Yeah,
has set in.
yeah, absolutely. So Colin had taken over in 1987. So the problem he's got then as a new manager is, what does he do? It's a team and a squad that needs a certain amount of renovation work, needs some new players. I mean, a lot of the team then have been with the club 5 or 6 years. You know yourself, you're a historian. Great teams last 3 or 4 years, don't they? No, after 3 or 4 years, you need to replenish the players. And Conor had a difficult decision to make in 87. Does he bring new players in? If it doesn't work, be accused of breaking up a championship winning team? Or does he just let it go for 12 months and then some people will accuse you of letting things drift while other people like Liverpool went ahead and bought players? And he chose to not do anything, which you can see at the time. And he didn't want to upset the apple cart with the existing squad. And so when he did buy players, as you say, he bought Tony Cottee, British record fame, in 1988. He bought Pat Nevins, Stuart McCall, Neil MacDonald, all decent players. But it was quite apparent early on that they weren't as good as the team that won the European Cup and this Cup and the title in 85. They just weren't as good. There was a split in the dressing room that Colin didn't really manage between the old established players and the newer players who were on good money because there was a big TV deal in 1988, and the players who joined clubs in that summer, they got really high wages. So these new players were on more money than the old squad who'd won stuff. And so it was quite apparent by the time we played the cup final in 89 that the team was nowhere good enough. It was in decline. The players weren't good enough that he brought in. You had other people now who were a bit stale. So by the time you get to 89-90, which is always the third season, is always the difficult one, I think, certainly at Everton. They were still competitive. They were top 6. I think they finished 6th in 1990, which would have been decent. I mean, we might have got you into Europe, mightn't you, in the old days in the UEFA Cup. But it was quite apparent that things weren't working. The away form was poor. I think they only won 12 times away from home in Colin's 3 seasons, full season in charge. And not really at big clubs. It was teams that ended up in the season relegated. That showed that the team didn't have the character, I think, to dig in on its travels. And so by the time you get to 90, the summer of 90, I think Colin is in the final year of his contract and he's in a difficult place. And I think that's when as you say, that's the key moment there, really, when it was quite clear that actually it wasn't going to work, but Colin was still on the job.
And the main player he could really rely upon was Welsh goalkeeper Neville Southall, who always really maintained his standards through the decline of the club. I was surprised there were so many offers for him. Reading your book, there were so many offers for him every season, it seemed like. But he remained with
Yeah,
the club.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was the irony being, because when people who know Neville Southall, you remember him, they always associate, you always associate him with successful Everton teams winning titles. But you're quite right. Is Neville's peak years was when the slide started from 1987. His peak years as a keeper were probably 1987 to about 1991. Those were his peak years. He probably had lots of practice with the Everton defence at the time. But yeah, it was not surprising that. I mean, Neville, he was one of the best paid players in the country. He was becoming stale. I think he was becoming disenchanted that the standards of the players who'd come in weren't as good as those who he'd played with in the successful years. His teammates, who had once been great players, were also in decline, and consequently, he was having to bail them out every week. And I think his head was turned. He spoke with Barcelona. I think Alex Ferguson made an effort to buy him. Man United. I think Kenny Dalglish at Liverpool was interested, certainly, because Neville at that time was probably the best goalkeeper in the world. To be fair, he just never had the chance to prove it in Europe or in World Cup, but I think he was the best goalkeeper in the world. Certainly the best goalkeeper in Britain. Yeah, it was that one of the peculiarities that his peak years when Everton was sliding. So we get to someone at 90, and Neville's had I think he's had enough. I don't think he had a great relationship with Colin Harvey. I think he fell out with them a few times. In the summer of 1990, he had made 3 transfer requests, which were all turned down by the club. And consequently, on the opening day of the season, it was false on the opening day of the season against Leeds United at Goodison. 2-0 down at half time. Neville was probably at fault for one, maybe 2 of the goals. And on a lovely summer's day, he does, at half time, I think there's different stories here, but I think he was just fed up. I think he may have been singled out, and he went off. Unbeknownst to the manager, Colin Harvey, he went off on his travels and went back on the pitch at half time and sat up against the post for most of the first half in front of the Leeds supporters in what looked, well, it was surreal development, but it looked like a one-person protest. Yeah, it was one of the oddest things I've seen at Goodison, to be honest, or anywhere really. Neville said he was just clearing his head. He was the senior pro, or one of the senior pros, where Colin Harvey was struggling as a manager. I think Neville should have been showing him some support rather than showing that there was a rift, really, publicly. And he quite rightly got vilified by the press and Everton supporters.
As we come into the 1990-91 season, after a few months in November, the inevitable happened and Colin Harvey was sacked. And to replace him, we have Howard Kendall coming back and Colin Harvey returning to his old post as assistant. This was supposed to be the move that would take Everton back to the glory
Yeah.
years. But soon enough, the reality set in that Everton and Kendall were no longer the force they once were. Was it early on that it seemed like this was never going to work?
Yeah. Well, in retrospect, a bit like Colin, I suppose. It was quite obvious from the start it was never going to work. It was a big shock. I mean, they'd sacked Colin after the League Cup defeat at Sheffield United. The general theory was that Joe Royle, who was then manager of Oldham, who were doing really well in the second division, obviously a former Everton player, great striker for the club, championship winner in 1970. It was just like it was going to be Joe. And, in the sorts of things that you don't see happening now, Howard walked in as manager. He'd be left Bilbao. He'd gone back to Manchester City. He was doing a good job there. He came back and everybody was just a massive, massive shock. And I think even bigger shock was Colin Harvey being sacked as manager 6 days before. Colin Harvey is back as coach, which was a shock. I think it was a shock to the Everton board because I don't think they expected or wanted Colin to come back as coach. I think Howard sort of sprung it upon them. I think consequently, there was a feeling though, as you say, well, they've done it before, 3 or 4 years before, but they do it again. But in that time, English football had changed quite a bit, really. Everton, as a club, we're not in the same place. We'd been a part of the Big Five in the mid-'80s because we were successful. But during the decline, we didn't have the advantages of other clubs in the Big Five. We didn't have Liverpool and Man United's national and international support. We didn't have Tottenham and Arsenal's London factor. We had big crowds, but also we had a lot of access to commerce and sponsorship and, you reasonably affluent spectators. Everton had neither of them advantages, so they were falling behind financially. And it was a team that still needed rebuilding. So in retrospect, it was never going to work. In those three or 4 years, Everton had gone into decline where other clubs moving upwards. I mean, as I say, George Graham was at Arsenal. 10 years before, Howard only had to beat Liverpool to be the best team in England. Now you have to beat Arsenal as well. Now you have to beat Ferguson and Man United that started to pick up in 90. They won the FA Cup. Leeds had come up in 1990 and they would win the title within 2 years. You also had, within a year of Howard taking over, Jack Walker walked into Blackburn and got Kenny Dalglish as manager. And John Hall, wealthy himself, got Kevin Keegan manager at Newcastle. So all of a sudden, you've gone from having one major rival to winning the title and being England's best club 10 years before. You've now got 6 or 7. And they've all got more money than you. So it wasn't just a Howard and Colin factor itself. It was the changes in English football going on at the time around Everton. Between 85, 86 and the start of the Premier League, I think Everton's gates went down by 30%. Everybody else's went up by 25%. And so that was a time when a lot of your money and commercial deals were based on the size of your crowd. And so that those gaps were appearing and it was far too big a gap. And I think to make up. And I think Howard had been, I think you get 10 years at the top, don't you? And Howard being 10 years before he'd done 10 years at the top. And it was strange bringing Colin back as well, given that, Colin had fallen out with a lot of the players as coach. So he's now, as manager, and now coming back as coach. There's got to be the confidant and all that type of stuff. It was just never going to be. I mean, the analogy I can think, and I draw that in the book, is when Malcolm Allison went back to Manchester City in 1979. He was worshipped by Manchester City fans because he'd taken him out of Manchester United's shadow with Joe Mercer 10 years before. But the magic had gone when he come back. The club had changed, Malcolm had changed. Even like Colin, Malcolm had the previous manager as coach, Tony Buck. So, and they were quite similar personalities, Howard and Malcolm. It was never going to work for either party, really. And it's one of the old adages in football, isn't it? Never go back.
In 91-92 season, Everton is slipping further back as, like you said, Everton is unable to compete in this new landscape. And it's no longer a desired destination in terms of transfers.
Yeah.
You mentioned Kendall tried to sign the likes of Haji, Dean Saunders, Jan Molby, Venison, but none of these worked out.
Yeah, I think the Dean Saunders one is probably the best example of where the club was and how it had fallen compared to it being in the mid-'80s, when they bought Gary Lineker, who was the most prized asset in English football in 1985. They'd spent a club record fee for him in 85. In 91, Howard wants to rebuild. He wants to get Everton back on the map. And Dean Saunders had a couple of good seasons, I think one good season, I think at Derby County. Striker, had pace, could score goals. And he similarly was a prized asset like Lineker had been in 85. And Howard put in a British record offer, actually hand delivered it to Derby County, 2.9 million. And he spent a lot of time trying to convince Dean Saunders to join the club, which he didn't have to do that with a Gary Lineker, did he? Because Gary Lineker was coming to Everton as champion. So you don't have to just either coming or you're not coming. We don't have to sell the club to you. We're champions. You start off at the top. But it was a bit more of a difficult sale with Saunders. And in the end, Dean because of his father played for Liverpool, Mark Wright, who's been a teammate at Derby, he'd also gone to Liverpool in the same summer. He went to Liverpool himself, which was a bit of a kick in the teeth for Howard and Everton supporters. I suppose the silver lining to the cloud was that Saunders didn't really hit it off at Liverpool. He was sold within 15 months. He was sold to Aston Villa, and Everton, on the rebound, as it were, went out and spent £1 million from Peter Beardsley from Liverpool, who was jettisoned because they bought Saunders. I don't think Souness fancied him because he'd obviously fallen out with Dalglish the year before. Kenny had left him out for long periods, and maybe thought he was over the hill. And Beardsley gave Everton a great service for 2 years, particularly his first season. He was a terrific signing, terrific player. Some would say probably a little bit too good for Everton. When a player puts passes in that he would normally expect all the top players to run for or be in position for, he was slightly on a different wavelength to his teammates. And I think that showed on occasions, but he was a terrific signing. So I think the failure to land Saunders was not necessarily, from a football perspective, a damaging development. It was more like a morale-sapping development, and that shows you where Everton stood in English football at the time compared to how they'd stood within 5 or 6 years before. By that stage, I mean, I don't know what we'd be getting. We'd be getting like £7 million income, where like Liverpool, Man United's getting 12 or 13 million pounds income a year. But like in the mid-80s, we're all about the same. And that was a big financial gap that you couldn't make up.
Now we come to the birth of the Premier League in 92-93 season. A running narrative in your book is the Big Five's attempts for a bigger piece of the pie
Yeah,
that eventually led to the creation of the Premier League. And Everton were clearly in the beginning part of that Big Five. However, by the start of the Premier League era, Everton were clearly no longer part of this group, which was a reflection of their gradual decline
yeah.
over the years. As the team is still not improving on the field, were there the beginnings of any calls for Kendall to be sacked, or was he always just as popular with the fans?
It's a very good question. I think it's a very good point you make. It's an interesting one, this. I think, going back to the Premier League, yeah, so everyone one of the Big Five. And the reason it's quite interesting, really, how history repeats itself, in that Philip Carter was the Everton chairman. He was also president of the Football League, who had responsibility, obviously, for league football in this country. And even though he was president, he wanted to look after the interests of the big clubs. And, you know, the big clubs in 1988 tried to break away themselves on a deal with ITV. 10 clubs on their own would get all the TV money. So it was like a domestic version of the European Super League. And as you well know, Sean, is like history repeats itself in football, doesn't it? So Carter got sacked because as president by the clubs, because as president of the Football League, he should have been looked after in interest of the 92 clubs, not the top 10 or 12. So consequently, we lost a little bit of influence in terms of the decision making within the Football League itself. That was the first thing. As I say, I touch on the financial side. We were now got gaps between who we thought was our competitors and where we stood. There was a big gap there. But I don't think people appreciated that really when they were looking at Howard in the early 90s. And I think it was far too recent for supporters to have sympathy because he brought success. In fact, they used that against him, I think, really. And I think the board used it against him, I think, a little bit, that you brought success before, you're not brought success now. And I think, you know, the football wasn't great. I suspect Howard, who had a few off the pitch issues I touch upon, was not necessarily in great shape himself. And then that led to a lot of unhappiness, I think, with fans. I think Howard wanted to go back to Spain. I talk a lot in the book about one of the reasons I think he went to Bilbao in '87 was, I think, he's had his head turned by Barcelona 12 months before in a move that didn't pan out because Terry Venables stayed another year. And I think Howard wanted to go back to Spain in the early 90s. He turned down Barcelona. I think he wanted probably to go back to Bilbao. And I think, I'm not sure whether his heart was really in it in the early 90s in the same way it has been in 10 years before. I think some of the hunger had gone. I think he realised he was fighting a losing battle financially with the big clubs. But having said that, you know, Aston Villa a similar size club for Everton. In the early 90s, they finished runners-up twice in the first division, won 2 League Cups in 94 and 96, so you could still be successful. Yeah, I think when you've won titles but you're no longer in contention, I think it probably just took away some of his hunger. But he was given stick by fans, and I think probably fair enough. To be fair, I think they expected better from him, and that was because in the early 90s, we were getting outperformed by, full due respect, clubs like Norwich City and QPR and Crystal Palace. Supporters knew that.
The story ends with the chaotic 1993-94 season. There's a boardroom battle. Kendall finally leaves and is replaced by Mike Walker. It's a disastrous season culminating with the Great Escape. I mean, an entire book could be written just about this season alone. So,
Yes,
as an
absolutely.
Everton fan, how did you experience that stressful season?
Oh, that's a good question again. I'm in the same way writing about it, to be honest with you. Thinking, was it really that close? At 9 minutes to going down. The irony being that Everton, as I say, one of the big five, one of the big clubs in England, who wanted to push for the Premier League to start, to get the riches, but in danger of being thrown out the very competition that they'd partially instigated, and the irony that that would have caused. But yeah, the root cause was in the summer of '93. We were actually unbelievably were top after 3 games. So we tailed off. And I think Howard, I say in the book that Howard probably knew what was going off the pitch about the takeover battle, how that was going to affect them, because John Moores had died. His shareholding was the battle for the shareholding power was between two groups. Bill Kenwright, who was the Everton director and the consortium, and Peter Johnson, who was the Tranmere Rovers owner, who wanted the shareholding. So there's a battle between those two. And I think Howard's realised, so this is the end of '93, that actually once that battle's sorted, they'll bring their own person in and I'm going to get sacked. So I think he walked before he was pushed. I think also as well, he'd had a bit of history with England, Howard. I'm sure he went to Spain in '87 because I think he thought that the England job would come up. And having that international experience would stand in his favour. I think in '90 at Manchester City, it was clear that Robson was going. Peter Swales, who was involved in the selection committee for the England manager, but was also his chairman. I think he sort of blocked Howard from sort of at least being a serious contender for the job. And in '93, when Graham Taylor went after the game against Holland, the FA had said that the New England manager would be not going to poach from an existing club, looking for a free agent. And I think Howard thought, if I leave Everton, I'll not only avoid the ignominy of being sacked, but I'll also be, one of the contenders for the England job. In fact, the contender. And I think that drove his decision to resign in December '93. He said it was to do with a failure to sign Dion Dublin from Manchester United. Howard said that he had watched Dublin play with the director, and they said he was interested in buying him. A director had said that he didn't look fit, that he was actually limping. And then when Howard said he'd done a deal with Ferguson, he said the board didn't back him, wouldn't give him the money, so he then resigned. I don't think a lot of that's true. To be fair, when you look at the facts, when you say when you do research, it's always important to look at the contemporary reports. I don't think any of that's true. I don't think there was an opportunity to watch Dublin. He said that he'd been to see him play, that he would have been in the reserves, but Dublin had been fit all season. He'd certainly not have done deal with Alex Ferguson, like he said. We offered 1.6 million, but Ferguson wanted 1.8 million. And Ferguson said that at the time when Howard went. So I think that was just a smokescreen because Howard just wanted to go, to be honest with you, for those reasons, as said, about to avoid being pushed. And I think he was interested in the England job. And that did make out for him because Terry Venables, ironically enough, he blocked him from getting the Barcelona job in 1986. Terry got the England job, but there was talk of Howard would be the caretaker until '94 because when Terry had a lot of business issues to sort out. So Terry and Howard's managerial career, they had several meeting points. So Howard went and then they looked around and I think they wanted to appoint a caretaker, Jimmy Gabriel, but we weren't winning games. We lost 6 out of 7 after Howard went. We gone to 6th, I think, 16th place in the table. Brought Mike Walker in from Norwich. He'd done a great job 2 years before, got them third into Europe. They won at Bayern Munich famously, knocked Bayern Munich out the UEFA Cup. he was seen as being an up-and-coming manager. Teams play good football. He had a couple of early wins, and I think that led to a bit of complacency. And before you know it, by the end of April, we're a couple of games away from relegation. We then lose at Leeds in the penultimate game, and we go into the final day of the season, playing Wimbledon, who were a very good team at the time. We were sixth. We needing to win, and for one of the teams above us, 3 teams above us who were in our sort of orbit, one of them didn't win. If those eventualities happened, then we'd stay up. And then, as you well know, we get beat 2-0 after 20 minutes against Wimbledon. We get a 4-2 as his penalty. Barry Vaughan scores a great goal in the second half, but we still need a win. And then 9 minutes from time, Graham Stewart sort of a block tackle at the end of the area, but it ends up being like a shot, and the ball squaring past Hans Segers and went into the net. And thanks to the results elsewhere, Everton stay up after an afternoon of drama where for most of the time we looked as though we were going down because we were getting beaten. The teams above us, some of them were winning anyway. So, yeah, it was dramatic. And, of course, infamously, and you have to touch on this book, became one of the key aspects of the court case involving the football betting and the betting on games and bribery that involving Hans Segers, alleged bribery, Segers, Grobbelaar and John Fashanu in the years that followed, particularly with regards to Segers had been the Wimbledon goalkeeper. There'd been stories and rumour that game had been fixed going round, and I think Segers himself had been approached when the story about Grobbelaar came out. I went to court twice, and the charges were found not guilty after the Segers was, and even though there was some evidence suggested being paid, he denied it was to do with the Wimbledon game, and it just only added to the drama, really. I mean, and to be fair, I don't know what I can't say, but I think the goal, it was a bit of a surprising shot by Stewart, because he went to shoot and it sort of rebounded off him, so you can see why a goalkeeper got caught by surprise, maybe. But the rumours about the game were there immediately, really, from '94, I believe. I think that's always, thankfully for Everton fans, Segers were not guilty. The club achieved what they did fairly and without anybody's assistance. So it rumbled on for several years, the Segers thing, but I think thankfully for the good name of football, he was found not guilty. Yeah, it's still one of the goodest and maddest afternoons.
On balance, we touched up early in the interview that some reference the European ban as one of the reference points for the decline. Another is the fact that Everton, in fact, just like Liverpool, these teams are criticized for being slow to keep up with the new landscape of football in the Premier League era.
Yeah.
Were these just some of the issues, or obviously there's more institutional reasons
I
why?
think it was more institutional. Everton didn't have, at the time in the early 90s when clubs were employing visionaries and people who could see the future, the commercial opportunities of football from the starting of the Premier League, from its increased popularity coming off the back of Italia 90. Everton failed to do so. We had Philip Carter being a major sheikh, moving and shaker within football. He was replaced as chairman in 1991 by Dr. David Marsh, who was a golfer. Very good golfer, but he was a golfer, not somebody who's going to drive the business forward. And I talk about that at the end, but the club has always been very insular, not very outward looking, and I think that was particularly the case in the 90s. That cost us dearly. So by the mid 90s, when the Premier League had started to take off, both on the pitch and commercially, Everton had been way left behind, and not just by the likes of the big rivals, by Man United and so on, Liverpool. You get left behind by Newcastle, Leeds, teams like that. That we never got that back, really. And to be fair, I mean, even in the Moyes era, when we were finishing fifth, we still had a wage bill that was less than Fulham and West Ham.
Looking back, despite his continuous devotion to Athletic Bilbao in the succeeding decades, was there a feeling that Kendall should have set his sights higher than a club like Bilbao?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He was linked and I think turned down offers from Real Madrid. He was linked with Juventus, and I say turned Barcelona down. I think Bilbao, they offered him a very good financial deal. absolutely. Far more in his pay packet at the end of the week than what he was getting at Everton, and with the golden handshake, I think that came into it. But I think it was seduced by the place. I mean, Bilbao are quite a similar club to Everton, quite local. Obviously, they've got a restriction on who they can recruit. Yeah, I think that looking back now, that was the big surprise, really. You've been linked with some of the biggest clubs in Europe who want you as manager. You know, even in England, there was talk of times in Manchester United, Arsenal, but you've gone to Bilbao, a club that can only sign Basques and are not in Europe. But I think he was seduced by the great people who ran the club. And I think he was seduced by that as much as anything else in the area. It was one of several strange decisions Howard took from 1987 onwards. He took 3 or 4 strange decisions going to Manchester City. You're probably the best manager in England, to Manchester City in the relegation battle. Coming back to Everton in 1990 is another one. I think probably resigning from Everton in 1993 is another one. So there was, at a time when he should have been at his peak and making the most of his opportunities and taking advantage of the success he'd had in the mid-80s, he was going into decline as a manager from a position of strength. And I think probably the starting point of that was going to Bilbao in 87.
In closing, what is the legacy of this Everton decade that we discussed in terms of the football history of England as a whole? Is it a cautionary tale of sorts?
Yeah, I think there's a few lessons learned there that actually we know it's always important to strengthen when you're at the top, which we failed to do. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is you've got to move forward as a club and see what your competitors are doing. I think in the late 80s, early 90s, commercially and financially, Everton just didn't do that. And I think that's the lesson learned. Because if you stand still when everybody else is moving forward, you're falling behind. And I think that's the most important thing. And we picked the worst time to stand still. We stood still when there was massive growth in English football on the back of the success of Italian 90, the popularity of the game, rising TV deals, and the start of the Premier League, which didn't generate a lot of money when it first started, but ultimately did. We stood still and were very insular when we should have been outward looking and more progressive. And I think that's the lesson learned, I think, for the wider game. If you do that as a club, then you fall behind. And I think the similarities between that period of Everton as, to say, Manchester United over the last decade, definitely. Where you see how Manchester United have been managed and have gone into decline and have fallen from being in a position of strength to falling behind their rivals on and off the pitch. And I think there's lots of similarities between United over the last 10, 12 years. Probably a bit longer than that, and then Everton from 85 to 94.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to Mr. Buckland's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. Again, this is the book, The End. From Glory to a Whole New Ball Game, Everton 1985 to 1994. We only scratched the surface, but this book really gets into the weeds season by season and goes through the history of the club. It's a very good reading, very informative. So, Gavin, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks, Shahan. Always a pleasure being on your show, and I love your podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you.